Close your eyes for a moment and picture this: an endless sea of golden sand stretching toward the horizon, where the air shimmers with heat and the only sound is the low, haunting moan of the wind as it curls around ancient ruins. That wind wasn't just empty noise to the people who once lived here. To them, it carried voices, whispers from gods long forgotten, messages from the divine woven into every gust and sigh. Across the vast deserts of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Arabia, civilizations rose and fell believing the wind was something sacred, a bridge between earth and heaven, a celestial messenger with secrets to share. Why would something as invisible and untouchable as the wind hold such power over human hearts? Imagine living in a world where every breeze could be a sign, a sudden storm, a life-giving rain, or the eerie calm before disaster. The desert's harsh beauty taught these cultures to listen closely, to hear the sacred in the rustle of palm leaves or the howl of a sandstorm. The Sumerians worshipped Enlil, the storm god whose breath shaped the world. The Egyptians saw the wind as the very breath of Shu, the deity who held the sky aloft. The Nabateans carved their city of Petra into cliffs that sang with the wind's voice, turning the desert's breath into an oracle. These weren't just stories, they were ways of understanding a force that could nourish crops or bury cities in an instant. Today, we're going on a journey through time, tracing the footsteps of those who heard divinity in the desert winds. We'll explore how ancient priests decoded messages in the gusts, how kings made decisions based on the direction of the breeze, and how even now, science is uncovering the strange truths behind these age-old beliefs. By the time we're done, you'll step outside and feel the wind differently, not just as air moving, but as an echo of a time when the world was alive with voices we've almost forgotten how to hear. So lean in and let's listen together. The desert winds are still whispering. All we have to do is pay attention. To the earliest desert cultures, wind was never just air in motion. It was the breath of the unseen world. Picture a nomadic herder in ancient Arabia watching a dust devil spiral across the dunes. Where we might see swirling dirt, they saw a spirit taking form, a visible sign of invisible forces at work. This primal connection between wind and the divine emerged from something simple yet profound: survival. In lands where water was scarce and crops fragile, the difference between a gentle breeze and a furious sandstorm could mean life or death. The wind brought the monsoon rains that filled wadis with precious water, but it also carried the scorching sirocco that could wither an entire harvest in a single day. Such power demanded explanation and reverence. Ancient minds didn't separate the natural from the supernatural like we do today. When the wind howled through Mesopotamian valleys, it wasn't just weather, it was Enlil's voice. The Babylonians recorded wind patterns on cuneiform tablets as carefully as kings chronicled battles, believing shifts in direction held omens for the future. A sudden gale from the west might warn of invading armies, while a steady eastern wind promised fertile seasons. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a sophisticated system of reading the environment, where every gust carried layered meaning. Even the direction mattered. The north wind, cool and moist, was often seen as benevolent, while the searing south wind became a symbol of divine displeasure. What made wind uniquely sacred across so many cultures was its paradoxes. It was invisible yet undeniable, gentle one moment and violent the next. You couldn't capture it like water or contain it like fire, yet it could erode mountains or sculpt dunes over centuries. This duality made it the perfect metaphor for the gods themselves, unknowable yet ever present. The Bedouin tribes of Arabia personified these contrasts in their wind spirits, some bringing poetic inspiration, others madness. A single desert zephyr might whisper secrets to a shaman or hurl enough sand to erase caravan trails entirely. No wonder wind became the original divine messenger, unpredictable, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Archaeology reveals how deeply this belief took root. At Göbekli Tepe, a 12,000-year-old temple in Turkey, pillars are carved with reliefs of swirling winds, proof that even in prehistoric times, humans saw the air as sacred. Later, the Sumerians built wind towers aligned to cardinal directions, while Egyptian priests timed rituals to the Nile's annual winds. These weren't passive observations, they were active collaborations with what people believed were conscious forces. When the wind changed direction, it wasn't random, it was a conversation. And in the silence of the desert, where the horizon stretches empty and the stars blaze at night, who could blame them for listening? The Sumerians saw the world through a lens where every gust of wind carried divine intention. At the center of this belief stood Enlil, the formidable storm god whose very breath could shape destinies. Unlike modern weather reports that speak of high-pressure systems, the Sumerians understood wind as the deliberate action of a conscious force. Enlil didn't just control the winds, he infused them with purpose, sending them forth as extensions of his will. The four cardinal winds served as his loyal messengers, each with its own temperament and domain. The north wind, crisp and invigorating, swept down from the mountains with promises of fertile soil and abundant harvests. Farmers welcomed its arrival, knowing its chill carried the seeds of renewal. But the south wind was a different beast entirely. Blistering and dry, it rolled off the desert like a vengeful spirit, cracking the earth and withering crops in its path. To the Sumerians, this wasn't just bad weather. It was a warning. Clay tablets from the city of Nippur describe priests meticulously recording wind shifts, interpreting them as omens for everything from royal successions to impending invasions. A sudden turn of the wind could signal Enlil's displeasure, urging kings to reconsider battles or delay coronations. One tablet even recounts how a prolonged east wind prompted the ruler Gudea to rebuild a temple, fearing neglect had angered the gods. What makes these beliefs so fascinating is their blend of poetry and practicality. The Sumerians didn't just personify the winds, they mapped their behaviors onto human concerns. The west wind, often associated with the sea, became a herald of trade and distant news. Merchants timed voyages to its rhythms, believing it carried Enlil's favor. Meanwhile, the east wind, though less documented, was thought to whisper secrets of the rising sun, linking it to divination and dawn rituals. These weren't abstract ideas, they were woven into daily life. Farmers planted according to wind patterns, architects aligned city gates to harness cooling breezes, and scribes preserved wind lore alongside laws and treaties. Archaeology offers glimpses into how deeply this reverence ran. At the ancient city of excavators found wind charms, tiny clay amulets shaped like swirling gusts, buried beneath doorways to ward off ill winds. Royal hymns praised Enlil as the one who rides the tempest, his voice thunderous yet his messages subtle. Even the famous epic of Gilgamesh echoes this, describing how the hero's fate was altered by a wind sent to test him. The Sumerians didn't see themselves as separate from nature, but as participants in a dialogue with forces far greater. When the wind changed, they listened. And in that listening, they found meaning not just in survival, but in the very fabric of the divine. To the ancient Egyptians, the wind was never just empty air. It was the invisible pulse of the gods moving through the world with purpose. At the heart of this belief stood Shu, the deity of air and sunlight, whose very body formed the space between earth and sky. Ancient texts describe him with arms outstretched, holding the heavens above his sister Tefnut, the moisture-laden goddess of dew. Together, they created the sacred boundary that kept chaos at bay, but Shu's role went beyond mere separation. His breath was the wind itself, a life-giving force that filled lungs and sails alike. When the Nile's waters stirred under a passing breeze, Egyptians saw Shu's fingers brushing the surface, a divine touch ensuring fertility and balance. Yet wind in Egypt was never one-dimensional. Shu's daughter, Sekhmet, embodied its fiercer side. With the body of a lioness and the heat of the desert sun, she rode the scorching winds as both destroyer and healer. Legends tell of her wrath unleashed. A single gust from her jaws could spread plague across cities. But that same power could purify. During the annual Omens, a 50-day windstorm that painted the sky orange with dust, people didn't just endure it, they revered it. Temples held rituals to channel Sekhmet's fury, believing the sand-laden winds scoured away spiritual corruption as surely as they cleaned physical decay from temple walls. Then there was Amun, the hidden one, whose presence lingered in every whispered breeze. Unlike Shu's visible dominion, Amun's connection to wind was subtle, a rustle in the reeds, a sigh through the papyrus. Priests at Thebes taught that his true voice could only be heard when the north wind died down, leaving absolute silence. In those moments, devotees strained to catch his counsel, as fleeting as a desert zephyr. This duality made Amun the ultimate mystery, a god so vast he filled the cosmos, yet as intimate as the breath in one's own chest. The Egyptians didn't just worship these forces, they wove them into daily survival. Sailors on the Nile timed voyages to the predictable northerly winds, offering tiny clay boats to Shu before departure. Farmers watched for the wind of Osiris, a gentle current said to carry the god's blessing for abundant harvest. Even architecture paid homage. Temple columns were spaced to amplify wind sounds, turning entire structures into instruments of the divine. At Karnak, certain passages still echo with a low hum when the Omens blows, as if the stones themselves are chanting. What makes Egypt's wind lore so compelling is its seamless blend of poetry and pragmatism. The same culture that mapped the stars with astonishing precision also believed a gust could carry a god's verdict. A physician might prescribe medicine while whispering a prayer to Sekhmet, acknowledging wind as both germ and cure. This wasn't contradiction, it was sophistication. To the Egyptian mind, the physical and spiritual weren't separate realms but intertwined threads, with wind as the shimmering stitch between them. High in the rose-red cliffs of Petra, the wind doesn't just blow, it speaks. The Nabateans, those ingenious traders who turned desert rock into a thriving metropolis, didn't merely build their city against the elements, they designed it to converse with them. Walk through the Sikh, the narrow gorge that serves as Petra's grand entrance, and you'll feel it, a sudden gust funneled between sandstone walls, whispering secrets only the ancients could decipher. This wasn't accidental architecture. The Nabateans carved channels and shafts into the rock face, turning entire facades like the treasury into colossal wind instruments. When the Hamzin wind roared in from the south, these structures transformed. The treasury's upper chambers, hollowed with precision, would hum with an otherworldly resonance, a sound priests claimed carried directives from Dashara, their chief deity. But the Nabateans weren't just passive listeners, they were meticulous record keepers. Inscriptions found near the high place of sacrifice detail how wind patterns dictated everything from market days to military campaigns. A steady north wind might signal the ideal time to dispatch caravans to Gaza, while an erratic eastern breeze could delay treaty signings. The Hamzin, though feared for its scorching breath, held special reverence. Arriving in spring, it wasn't just a weather event but a celestial herald. Tablets describe priests climbing to wind-worn altars at dawn, tracing the Hamzin's path as it scoured the mountains, listening for coded messages in the way it rattled votive offerings or whistled through tomb doorways. What's striking is how seamlessly the sacred and practical intertwined. The same wind that guided spiritual rituals also powered Petra's survival. Ingenious water channels designed to catch rare rains doubled as acoustic conduits. Wind rushing through them created eerie harmonics that echoed across the city. Traders swore these sounds predicted distant storms or approaching rivals. Even Petra's famed tombs, often dismissed as mere monuments, may have served as wind observatories. Recent studies reveal that certain burial chambers align with seasonal wind shifts, their entrances positioned to amplify specific frequencies during solstices. The Nabateans' legacy lingers in the desert's breath. Modern visitors still report uncanny phenomena, sudden cold drafts in sun-baked corridors, or whispers seeming to rise from empty courtyards. Science explains much of this as venturi effects and acoustic refraction, but the wonder remains. In a world where we've tamed nature with technology, Petra stands as a reminder of a time when humanity didn't just endure the wind, but knelt to hear its wisdom. The stones still remember. Lean close and you might catch the echo of a prayer carried on a breeze 2,000 years old. In the vast deserts of ancient Persia, the wind wasn't just a force of nature, it was a sacred courier, a bridge between the earthly and the divine. Zoroastrians called it Vayu, a name that carried weight far beyond its literal meaning. To them, Vayu was the breath of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god, a pure and untouchable force that carried prayers upward like incense smoke. Picture this, a fire temple at dawn where priests tended flames that never died. The wind wasn't just keeping those fires alive, it was transforming their sparks into messages, lifting them toward the heavens. This wasn't mere symbolism, it was a living connection, a way to ensure every whispered plea reached the ears of the divine. But Vayu's role went beyond delivery. It was also a judge, a cosmic scale balancing justice and mercy. Gentle breezes that cooled the brow of a farmer after honest labor were seen as blessings, tangible proof of Ahura Mazda's favor. Yet when storms ripped through villages, flattening homes and scattering livestock, Zoroastrians interpreted this as divine retribution, a reminder that moral order had been disrupted. The wind didn't just reflect the natural world, it revealed the state of the human soul. A sudden calm after a sinner's repentance wasn't coincidence, it was Vayu's response, a celestial sigh of forgiveness. This duality made wind worship deeply personal. Farmers would pause mid-plow to watch the way the wind bent the barley, searching for signs. Merchants setting sail on the Persian Gulf would release handfuls of sand into the air, reading the patterns of its fall like an oracle. Even children learned early that to whistle aimlessly on a still day was to risk summoning unfriendly gusts, a lesson in respecting the wind's capricious power. The sacred texts, the Avesta, are filled with hymns to Vayu, praising its ability to cleanse what is hidden, a reference to both purifying dust storms and the unmasking of secret sins. What's remarkable is how these beliefs persist. Modern Zoroastrians still perform the clean wind ritual, where they open windows during prayers to invite Vayu's presence. Towers of silence where the deceased are laid to rest are always positioned to catch the prevailing winds, ensuring the soul's swift ascent. Science might explain these winds as seasonal trade patterns, but to the faithful, they remain a thread connecting humanity to something greater. The desert winds that once carried the words of prophets now rustle through ceremonies thousands of years old, a whisper across time that still stirs the soul. Long before the call to prayer echoed across the Arabian sands, the desert was alive with whispers not of men but of djinn. These elusive beings, born from smokeless fire according to ancient lore, were as much a part of the landscape as the shifting dunes. They didn't walk the earth like humans, They rode the winds, their presence announced by sudden whirlwinds that spiraled out of nowhere or the eerie moaning of air through narrow wadis. To the Bedouin tribes who traversed these harsh lands, every gust carried potential meaning. A gentle breeze at dusk might signal a benevolent djinn offering protection, while the dreaded simum, a scorching wind that could boil the moisture from a man's lungs in hours, was said to be the exhale of a furious spirit punishing those who dared cross its domain. What's fascinating is how deeply this belief influenced daily life. Poets highly revered in pre-Islamic Arabia often claimed their most brilliant verses came not from their own minds but from jinn who whispered through the wind. The legendary poet Imru al-Qais spoke of composing his greatest works under the influence of a desert zephyr that spoke in rhymes. This wasn't just romantic exaggeration. It reflected a genuine belief that creativity itself was a collaboration between humans and the unseen. Even today, the Arabic word for inspiration, ilham, carries echoes of this idea, literally meaning what the wind brings in. But the relationship between jinn and wind wasn't always so poetic. Caravans crossing the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, told chilling tales of the Habub, a massive sandstorm that could swallow entire camps. Survivors described hearing voices in the roaring winds, some coaxing them toward phantom oases, others laughing as they stumbled blindly. Modern meteorology explains these storms as atmospheric phenomena, but to the ancients, they were unmistakable evidence of jinn at play. Protective rituals emerged. Travelers would tie knots in their headscarves to trap malicious spirits or recite verses to ward off wind-borne curses. Islam later absorbed these beliefs, though with a theological shift. The Quran acknowledges jinn as real beings, some righteous, others rebellious. Verses describe how Solomon commanded jinn through the wind, and how storms could be both punishment and mercy from Allah. This duality persists in folk practices. In parts of Oman, elders still read the wind before major decisions, interpreting its direction as a sign of divine will. The simum, though now understood scientifically, retains its ominous nickname, the poison wind, a linguistic relic of its supernatural past. The desert's breath, once the playground of capricious spirits, endures as a bridge between worlds. Scientists measure its speed and direction, but for many, it still carries something ineffable. Stand alone in the dunes at twilight, when the wind shifts and the sands seem to murmur, and you might just understand why the ancients listened so closely. The jinn may have retreated from modern textbooks, but in the silence between gusts, their whispers linger. The desert winds that whispered divine secrets also shaped the fortunes of kingdoms, not just through prophecy, but through the relentless movement of goods and gold. Picture a Roman merchant standing on the docks of Berenice in Egypt, watching the horizon where the Red Sea met the sky. His ship, loaded with amphorae of wine and jars of olive oil, couldn't depart until the Hippalus wind arrived, the ancient name for the monsoon that Greek sailors had discovered could carry them straight to India in just 40 days. This wasn't mere navigation, it was a high-stakes gamble with the gods of the air. When those winds blew true, they didn't just fill sails, they filled treasuries, bringing back pepper, pearls, and silk that would glitter in the forums of Rome. But the monsoon was only one thread in the wind's global tapestry. Along the Silk Road, caravan masters timed their journeys to the rhythm of desert winds, knowing a single sandstorm could bury a train of 100 camels without a trace. The Tarim Basin's Lop Nor winds were so predictable that merchants could calculate travel days by their intensity, while the Pamir Mountains' icy gusts forced alternate routes through precarious passes. These weren't arbitrary obstacles, they dictated which empires thrived. Palmyra rose to prominence not just because of its oasis, but because it lay where the westerly winds eased the crossing from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. What's striking is how commerce and cosmology intertwined. Phoenician traders casting off from Tyre would scatter barley cakes into the wind as offerings to Baal Hammon, believing the right breeze could mean the difference between reaching Cadiz or being dashed against the rocks of Cyprus. Indian merchants at the port of Muziris consulted wind oracles before loading their vessels with Malabar spices, interpreting the rustle of palm fronds as approval from Vayu, their wind god. Even the Vikings, though far from deserts, shared this reverence. Their sagas tell of fair windstones carved with runes, said to summon favorable gales when stroked in the right direction. Archaeology reveals how deeply this reliance ran. Shipwrecks along the Mediterranean coast often contain wind charms, tiny bronze figurines of winged deities nailed to masts. A first-century trading vessel discovered near Naples held a cargo of frankincense and a clay tablet inscribed with a plea to the four winds of heaven for safe passage. Such finds prove that for ancient merchants, wind wasn't just a physical force. It was a business partner with its own moods and demands. The legacy of these wind-driven routes endures in unexpected ways. Modern shipping lanes still follow many of the same paths blazed by monsoon-powered dhows, and the phrase "trade winds" itself is a linguistic fossil from an era when wind patterns were as critical as GPSs today. Yet we've lost something in our mechanized age, that visceral understanding of wind as both ally and adversary. When a Phoenician captain felt the first kiss of the Etesian winds after weeks of calm, it wasn't just relief he felt, it was gratitude to something greater than himself. Today's container ships may dwarf those ancient vessels, but no engine roar can match the awe of watching the wind reshape history, one gust at a time. Before maps or meteorology, civilizations turned to the wind as the original oracle, a living, breathing messenger that could reveal the future if you knew how to listen. At Delphi, where the famed Pythia channeled Apollo's prophecies, priests didn't just rely on her trances, they watched the sacred grove outside the temple. When the wind stirred the laurel leaves in a particular rhythm, it was seen as confirmation of the god's presence. A sudden stillness might signal disapproval, while a whirlwind kicking up dust was interpreted as urgent warning. This wasn't unique to Greece. Halfway across the known world, the Babylonian Baru priests performed elaborate rituals atop ziggurats, tracing wind patterns in smoke from burning cedar. A north wind during the ritual meant the gods favored the king's upcoming campaign, while an erratic southeasterly gust could postpone coronations for months. The precision of these practices reveals astonishing sophistication. Saharan Tuareg tribes, who still raid the wind today, distinguish between 7 distinct types of gusts, each with its own name and meaning. The Tehet, a soft morning breeze, signals safe travel, while the Azengir, a midday wind that twists sand into spirals, warns of impending conflict. Their divination methods, passed down orally for generations, involve scattering fine sand onto a taut goatskin drum and interpreting the patterns left by passing winds. Similar techniques appear in ancient Chinese texts, where court diviners released feathers into the air, mapping their trajectories to predict harvest yields or rebellions. What connects these traditions across continents is the belief that wind carried coded messages. The Siwa oasis in Egypt, home to Amun's legendary oracle, positioned its speaking tubes to amplify specific wind frequencies during ceremonies. Pilgrims seeking answers would stand in designated chambers where priests translated the harmonic vibrations into divine counsel. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs built wind courts of open-air temples where priests observed how breezes moved through hanging shells and beads, believing Quetzalcoatl spoke through their collisions. Even the Bible's Book of Kings describes Elijah identifying God's voice not in the earthquake or fire, but in a still small wind. The endurance of these practices is perhaps most striking among the Navajo, whose wind talkers served in World War II not just as code communicators, but as modern-day interpreters of ancestral wind wisdom. They'd listen to desert breezes before key battles, seeking guidance in tones their ancestors would recognize. Today, meteorology explains the mechanics of wind, but modern storm chasers still report uncanny intuitions, a prickling sense before a tornado forms, or knowing which way a gale will turn. Science calls it pattern recognition, the ancients called it listening. Whether through leaves, sand, or the hum of a temple wall, humanity has always strained to hear the universe whispering on the wind. Ancient architects didn't just build structures, they composed symphonies in stone, with the wind as their invisible conductor. Take the Great Pyramid of Giza, where narrow shafts piercing the inner chambers weren't merely ventilation channels. Recent studies reveal these passages align precisely with the path of the northern stars and the prevailing winds of the Nile Delta. When the annual Shemu winds blew in late spring, they funneled through these shafts with eerie precision, creating harmonic frequencies that resonated through the king's chamber. Egyptologists now believe this wasn't accidental. The pyramid's builders may have intentionally tuned these spaces to vibrate at specific pitches, turning the entire monument into a colossal wind harp. Imagine standing in that darkness as the walls hum around you, not just air moving, but the very voice of the cosmos speaking through stone. Half a world away, the Nabateans engineered Petra's treasury with similar genius. That iconic facade isn't just a pretty face, it's a meticulously calculated wind amplifier. Carved channels hidden behind the ornate columns catch the desert's afternoon breezes, funneling them into narrow flutes that produce an ethereal choir-like sound. Locals called it Al-Kosne's whisper, believing the spirits of their ancestors spoke through these stone lungs. What's astonishing is how the effect varies by season. During the spring equinox, when the wind shifts to the northwest, the entire facade vibrates at a frequency that makes sand dance across its steps, a phenomenon modern acousticians have measured at 110 Hz, the same pitch known to induce trance states in ritual ceremonies. But the most haunting examples come from Chaco Canyon, where the ancestral Pueblones constructed their great kivas with wind catcher windows. These carefully positioned openings create vortexes when the high desert winds rush through, generating low-frequency tones that mirror the human heartbeat. Archaeocaustic researchers have recorded these infrasound waves traveling through the canyon's sandstone walls, theorizing that the vibrations may have enhanced spiritual experiences during ceremonies. It's no coincidence that these structures align with solstice winds. The builders weren't just observing nature, they were collaborating with it, turning architecture into a conduit between realms. Even today, these ancient techniques baffle engineers. At Malta's Haga Kim temples, megaliths weighing 50 tons are perforated with holes that whistle in precise musical intervals when the sirocco blows. In Greece, the Tower of the Winds in Athens still functions as a wind vane after 2,000 years, its sundials and water clocks synchronized to seasonal breezes. What unites these marvels is their creators' profound understanding of wind as both physical force and sacred messenger. They didn't just build against the elements, they built with them, crafting spaces where every gust carried meaning, every whisper might be prophecy. The stones still sing their secrets if we're patient enough to listen. When the gods grew angry, they didn't just send rain or fire, they unleashed the wind. Few myths capture this fury more vividly than the storm in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the god Enlil loosed winds so violent they tore the heavens like a curtain. For 6 days and nights, tempests pounded the earth, flattening cities and drowning mountains until only a single boat remained. What's striking isn't just the scale of destruction, but the wind's dual role. It's both weapon and warning. Before the deluge, the text describes a black wind howling through Uruk's streets, a harbinger meant to give the righteous time to flee. This wasn't mindless violence, it was divine punctuation, a cosmic reset button pressed with gale force winds. The same theme echoes in the Exodus story, where Yahweh splits the Red Sea with an east wind strong enough to walk upon. Here, wind becomes an instrument of both deliverance and doom, saving the Israelites while drowning Pharaoh's army. Ancient listeners would have recognized the symbolism immediately. In Near Eastern cultures, the east wind was synonymous with divine intervention. It's the same wind that later withers Jonah's shade-giving plant, reminding him of God's sovereignty. These narratives share a profound insight. Wind doesn't just destroy or save, it reveals. When it roars through myth, it exposes who truly holds power, who's favored, and who's doomed. But why wind? Why not earthquakes or plagues? The answer lies in its unsettling intangibility. Unlike fire or flood, wind is invisible until it acts. You can't see the force that topples temples, only its aftermath. This made it the perfect metaphor for divine will, unpredictable, uncontrollable, and utterly undeniable. Greek myths lean into this with the Anamoi, wind gods whose moods shift like the seasons. Boreas, the north wind, could freeze ships mid-voyage as punishment for disrespect, while Notus, the south wind, scorched crops when mortals grew arrogant. Even the Norse had Hrísvelg, the corpse-eating giant whose wingbeats became the winds that heralded Ragnarök. The chilling consistency across cultures suggests something deeper than coincidence. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, storm myths follow a pattern. Winds rise as divine displeasure mounts, peak at the moment of judgment, then fade into eerie calm once justice is served. The Aztecs feared Tezcatlapocas, smoking mirror winds, said to erase entire cities when human sacrifice fell short. Hindu texts describe Vayu purging the world with cyclones when Dharma collapses. These aren't just weather reports, they're moral barometers, with wind speed as the gauge. Perhaps most telling is how these stories endured. When volcanic eruptions or earthquakes faded from oral tradition, wind-based punishments remained vivid. There's an intimacy to wind's wrath, it's personal. A hurricane doesn't just kill, it howls your name as it destroys. That psychological edge kept these myths alive, whispered around fires long after the civilizations that birthed them turned to dust. Even now, when a storm knocks out power or flattens towns, you'll hear people murmur the old question, what did we do to deserve this? The wind's answer, as always, blows through the silence left behind. Long before the first sunrise painted the desert sky, ancient storytellers imagined the world beginning with a whisper, not of water or fire, but of wind. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the universe starts as a formless void where only two forces exist, the freshwater god Apsu and the saltwater goddess Tiamat. Between them stirs the primordial wind, a restless force personified as the god Marduk. This isn't just any breeze, it's the first motion in existence, a divine breath that agitates the cosmic waters until they give birth to the gods themselves. The imagery is profound. Creation doesn't begin with light or land, but with the restless energy of air in motion, shaping chaos into order through its ceaseless stirring. Half a world away, the Quran echoes this motif with striking similarity. Surah Al-Hayr describes Allah sending the winds as heralds of His mercy, scattering life, giving rain across barren lands. But earlier verses go further. They depict the wind present at creation itself, carrying the divine command that shaped mountains and valleys. For desert dwellers, this made visceral sense. They watched how wind sculpted dunes overnight, how it could wear down stone over centuries. If something so intangible could reshape the earth, why couldn't it have helped form the world at its very beginning? The connection between wind and life's breath appears even more vividly in Egyptian mythology. The Heliopolitan creation myth describes Autumn, the first god, emerging from the watery chaos of none. But he doesn't act alone. His children Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture, are born from his sneeze, a sudden expulsion of breath that becomes the first wind. Here, the metaphor is unmistakable. Just as a baby's first cry fills its lungs with air, the universe's first act is a divine inhalation. The pyramid texts reinforce this, stating the pharaoh's soul would be renewed by the north wind, tying the very concept of afterlife to eternal breath. What unites these stories across cultures is their insight into wind's fundamental nature. Unlike earth or water, wind is invisible yet undeniable, a perfect symbol for the life force itself. The Navajo creation tale speaks of the wind people who entered the first humans' nostrils to give them spirit. Polynesian legends describe Maui capturing the winds in a gourd, releasing them in measured breaths to animate the world. Even the Hebrew ruach carries this duality, meaning both wind and spirit, the same word used when Genesis says, "The Spirit of God hovered over the waters." Archaeology offers tangible proof of how deeply this belief took root. At Catalhoyuk, one of humanity's oldest cities, wall paintings depict birthing scenes where goddesses exhale spirals representing both wind and life. In Peru's Chavin culture, temple conch shells were carved to whistle when wind blew through them, a deliberate echo of the world's first sound. These artifacts suggest our ancestors didn't just tell stories about wind's creative power, they built rituals around it, turning myth into lived experience. Perhaps most poignant is how these ancient intuitions align with modern science. We now know winds carry microorganisms across continents, seeding life in barren places. The same particles that once made dust devils seem like dancing spirits actually transport vital nutrients. When the ancients called wind the breath of the gods, they weren't entirely wrong. It quite literally carries the ingredients for life itself. Their poetry was prophecy, their metaphors closer to reality than they could have imagined. The next time you feel a breeze on your face, consider this. You're touching the same force that every culture in every desert once saw as the universe's first whisper. Before light pierced the darkness or land rose from the sea, there was wind, restless, invisible, and alive with possibility. Our ancestors heard in its sigh the echo of creation's first moment, and perhaps we still can if we listen closely enough. The desert winds that ancient civilizations once worshipped as divine messengers are now mapped by satellites and explained by atmospheric physics. Yet when scientists peer into the mechanics of these phenomena, they uncover truths that align with ancestral intuition in startling ways. Take the harmattan, the great West African wind that paints the sky orange with Saharan dust. Modern research reveals this annual event carries phosphorus and iron particles all the way to the Amazon rainforest, literally fertilizing the jungle with minerals from across the ocean. The ancient Tuareg tribes who called these winds the breath of the desert god weren't entirely wrong. Their legends described the harmattan as a bringer of life, sprinkling invisible blessings over the land. Today's soil samples prove there was profound wisdom in that poetic observation. Equally fascinating is what happens when wind meets human biology. Researchers at the University of Hertfordshire discovered that certain low-frequency wind sounds, like those produced when desert gusts whistle through narrow canyons, vibrate between 7 and 19 Hz. These frequencies fall within the range known to trigger altered states of consciousness. When such winds swept through Petra's rock-cut chambers or Egypt's pyramid passages, they may have literally induced the trance-like states priests described as hearing the gods. The same phenomenon explains why so many sacred sites were built in wind-carved landscapes, from the howling slot canyons of the American Southwest to the singing sands of the Gobi Desert. These places generate natural infrasound that vibrates at frequencies capable of producing visions or profound spiritual experiences. Meteorologists have also unraveled the mystery behind wind's dual nature, its capacity to both nurture and destroy. The same Khamsin wind that Egyptian farmers relied on to cool summer nights is now understood as a thermal low-pressure system, pulling hot air from the Sahara. Its destructive sandstorms occur when this system collides with Mediterranean fronts, creating swirling vortices that can reach hurricane speeds. What ancient texts interpreted as gods battling, Shu wrestling with Set, modern science explains as clashing air masses. Yet both frameworks capture wind's essential paradox. It clears and corrupts, creates and consumes, often simultaneously. Perhaps most remarkably, contemporary physics echoes the spiritual concept of wind as messenger. Atmospheric scientists now track global dust trails, particles that circumnavigate the planet on high-altitude winds, carrying everything from volcanic ash to microbial life. These airborne highways function exactly as ancient myths described, invisible couriers transporting materials across vast distances. When Babylonian priests claimed the north wind carried messages from distant lands, they weren't speaking metaphorically. Pollen analysis proves Mediterranean winds regularly deposited exotic plant spores in Mesopotamia, tangible evidence of far-off places. The convergence of ancient wisdom and modern science suggests our ancestors weren't merely inventing stories to explain what they didn't understand. They were acute observers who recognized patterns we're only now verifying with instruments. A Navajo elder watching dust devils dance across Canyon de Chelly, and a meteorologist analyzing vortex formation might use different vocabularies, but they're describing the same profound truth. Wind is the Earth's living breath, both knowable and mysterious, measurable yet forever whispering secrets just beyond our grasp. Across the ancient world, civilizations who never met and cultures separated by oceans somehow imagined their wind gods in eerily similar ways. Greece's Aeolus, ruler of the winds, clutches a bag stuffed with tempests he can unleash at will. Half a world away in Japan, Fujin, the red-faced wind god, grips his own billowing sack, forever caught mid-stride as he races across the sky. Even the Aztec wind god Ehecatl wears a swirling conch shell, its spiral shape mimicking the cyclones he commands. This isn't just coincidence. When cultures as distant as Scandinavia and Mesoamerica depict their wind deities with the same symbolic accessories, we're witnessing something profound: humanity's shared attempt to make sense of an invisible force that shaped their survival. The wind bag motif reveals how deeply people connected wind with containment and release. Sailors from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea told variations of the same cautionary tale anger a wind god, and they'll open their sack, unleashing chaos. The Norse sagas describe Odin storing winds in his mead horn, while Polynesian legends speak of Maui trapping the trade winds in a magical gourd. These stories weren't just colorful metaphors, they reflected real observations. Ancient mariners noticed how winds seemed to gather strength in certain locations, straits like the Aegean's Dardanelles or Japan's Kanman Strait, behaving as if some cosmic valve had been opened. The imagery also hints at an early understanding of atmospheric pressure, with gods compressing winds like air in a bellows before release. But the similarities go deeper than iconography. Nearly every wind deity embodies a paradox. They're both life-givers and destroyers. The Hindu god Vayu, whose name means the purifier, could spread pollen to fertilize crops or whip up dust storms to blind armies. The Cherokee wind spirit Unalanuhi rides a whirlwind, bringing spring rains but also tornadoes as punishment for broken taboos. This duality mirrors humanity's lived experience with wind. The same breeze that filled sails could sink ships, that cooled summer nights might also spread wildfires. By personifying these contradictions, cultures found a way to negotiate with the unpredictable. Perhaps most telling are the shared gender dynamics. Male wind gods like Enlil or the Slavic Stribog often represent controlled, directional winds, predictable forces tied to seasons and agriculture. Female wind spirits, meanwhile, tend to embody wind's wildness. The Greek harpies were storm-winged women who snatched souls, while the Inuit Sela was an unpredictable goddess whose moods shifted like Arctic gusts. This split reflects ancient societal views. Men were associated with order and cultivation, women with nature's untamed aspects, yet exceptions prove the rule. The Mesopotamian Lilitu, a wind demoness, became the template for later male storm gods, showing how these archetypes evolved across cultures. What emerges from these comparisons isn't just a catalogue of myths, but a map of human cognition. Faced with a force they couldn't see but couldn't ignore, our ancestors reached for the same symbolic language bags, breath, swirling cloaks, to make the intangible tangible. When Fujian's winds toppled Mongol fleets invading Japan or Aeolus aided Odysseus, people weren't just telling stories. They were encoding survival knowledge, warning generations about monsoon seasons and hurricane months through divine narratives. The next time you see a storm brewing on the horizon, remember, those dark clouds carry echoes of every culture that ever looked to the sky and wondered who or what was stirring the air. To the ancient mariner, the wind was no mere weather pattern. It was a temperamental spirit that demanded respect and ritual. Phoenician sailors crossing the Mediterranean would cast loaves of bread and amphorae of wine into the waves when the winds died, believing these offerings would stoke the breath of their storm god Baal-Hamon. But this was no blind superstition. Modern oceanographers confirm that certain windless zones, like the infamous doldrums near the equator, could strand ships for weeks. Those bread loaves weren't just sacrifices, they were survival strategies, tangible attempts to negotiate with forces beyond human control. On land, the rituals took different forms but shared the same urgency. In the Andes, Quechua farmers still perform the Huayra Watana ceremony when planting season arrives. Dressed in feathered headdresses that mimic swirling winds, they dance counter-clockwise in spiral patterns, stamping the earth to awaken the mountain breezes. Anthropologists tracing this tradition found its roots in pre-Incan cultures, who observed how circular winds preceded rainstorms. Their dances weren't mere performances, but precise meteorological reenactments, human bodies becoming living weather vanes to summon what they needed most. The Aztecs took wind appeasement to its most dramatic extreme. During droughts, priests would climb the round temple of Ehecatl, uniquely designed with cylindrical walls to funnel wind, and sacrifice quail by slitting their throats so the blood would spray into the air. Codices depict how the wind god's mask would be placed to catch these crimson droplets, the life force carried upward by the very element they sought to influence. What seems grotesque to modern eyes was, in context, a sophisticated act of reciprocity. Just as wind brought life-giving rain, the Aztecs believed they must return life energy to sustain the cosmic balance. Asia transformed wind rituals into celebrations that endure today. Japan's Hamamatsu festival sees hundreds of giant kites emblazoned with family crests battling in the sky, a tradition originating from samurai who flew kites to tame typhoon winds. In Bali, the annual Pajawesi ceremony features wind chimes crafted from bamboo and silver, their harmonies believed to purify the air of malevolent spirits. These aren't fossilized traditions but living dialogues with the wind, where ancient symbolism meets modern community bonding. What unites these diverse practices is their underlying wisdom. Before Doppler radar, these rituals encoded generations of observational knowledge. The Greek practice of sacrificing white lambs before the Artesian winds blew wasn't just piety. Those winds reliably arrived in late spring, signaling safe sailing season. Berber nomads still tie blue cloth to trees when the hot, Churgui wind blows. Science now confirms the color's psychological cooling effect. Every ribbon, dance, and offering carried layers of meaning, part prayer, part weather almanac, part communal memory. Perhaps most poignant are the wind rituals that became art. In China's Fujian province, elderly women sing ancient wind songs in crumbling stone towers designed to amplify their voices across valleys. The lyrics, passed down for centuries, contain precise descriptions of cloud formations that predict storms. These aren't just folk tunes but sonic survival guides, their melodies shaped by millennia of listening to the sky's whispers. When a wizened singer tilts her face to the breeze and lets the notes rise, she's not performing for tourists. She's continuing the oldest human conversation of all, one that began when our ancestors first looked up and wondered how to speak back to the wind. Wind whistling through the rigging of a ship wasn't just background noise to ancient sailors. It was a conversation with the unseen, one that required careful etiquette. Maritime traditions worldwide held that whistling aboard a vessel could anger the wind spirits, provoking them to answer with a devastating storm. This belief wasn't limited to Europe. Polynesian navigators called it Huana Kamakani, the taboo of summoning winds with human breath. The logic was universal. Mimicking the wind's voice was seen as arrogant, a challenge to forces far beyond human control. Fishermen in Scotland took this so seriously they'd reprimand even children for puckering their lips on deck, while Baltic crews believed a single careless whistle could wake the wind-old man from his slumber, sending him roaring across the waves. On land, the rituals shifted to harness the wind's favor rather than avoid its wrath. In the Carpathian Mountains, villagers still tie colorful ribbons to tree branches on hilltops, a practice dating back to Dacian tribes who believed these fluttering fabrics could catch gentle breezes and anchor them to the valley. The logic was tactile. If the wind could be seen tugging at the cloth, it was being held in place. Similar traditions appear in Mongolia, where nomadic families tie blue silk scarves to their jur tents, not just for decoration but as wind lures. The color, sacred to Tengri, the sky god, was thought to attract benevolent zephyrs while repelling dust storms. Some of the most intriguing wind taboos revolve around domestic routines. Moroccan households still avoid sweeping floors after sunset, fearing the broom might chase away the night winds believed to carry blessings from the desert. In rural Greece, hanging laundry during certain moon phases was forbidden, not due to practicality, but because elders claimed the wind could steal the vitality from damp clothes. Even mundane actions like opening doors too forcefully were policed in medieval Germany, where a sudden slam was said to wake the house wind, disturbing the delicate balance of air spirits guarding the home. What makes these superstitions so fascinating is their dual nature: part poetry, part proto-science. The Welsh practice of placing holly branches in barns to divert storm winds might seem whimsical until you learn holly's waxy leaves actually reduce wind resistance, making it an effective natural windbreak. The Navajo prohibition against pointing at whirlwinds, said to invite the spinning spirits closer, aligns with modern safety advice about avoiding dust devil paths. These weren't just irrational fears, they were encoded wisdom, ways of navigating a world where wind could mean the difference between a full harvest and starvation. The persistence of these beliefs reveals something profound about human psychology. When Baltic farmers whispered prayers to the rye mother, before cutting grain lest the wind scatter their crop. They were acknowledging the fragility of survival. Today, we may no longer fear angering Aeolus by whistling, but watch how people instinctively lower their voices when the trees start swaying violently. That primal recognition of wind as something alive, something listening, still lingers in our bones. The next time you see a ribbon fluttering on a hiking trail or feel a sudden chill breeze in a still room, remember, you're witnessing the last echoes of a time when every gust carried meaning and the air itself was sacred. The great wind gods of old didn't vanish overnight. They faded like a desert breeze at dusk, their power slowly leached away by the rising tide of monotheism. When Christianity spread across the Mediterranean, it didn't erase the old beliefs so much as absorb them. The Holy Spirit descended as a rushing wind at Pentecost, echoing the storm voices of Zeus and Baal, but with a crucial difference. This wind wasn't a deity to be bargained with, just a fleeting sign of divine presence. Islam, too, kept the poetry of wind while draining its personhood. The Quran describes Allah's will as carried on the wind, and the Arabic word "ri" still holds that ancient duality, meaning both breath and spirit, a linguistic fossil of the old ways. But these were no longer forces to worship, just metaphors to contemplate. Science delivered the final blow. By the Enlightenment, scholars like Galileo and Newton had reduced wind to equations, pressure gradients, Coriolis effects, the mechanical dance of high and low fronts. The Romantic poets might still rhapsodize about wild west winds, but sailors now consulted barometers instead of priests. Yet something curious happened. The old beliefs didn't die. They went underground, resurfacing in folklore and idioms. English farmers muttered about the devil's breath when unseasonable gales ruined crops, while Mediterranean grandmothers crossed themselves at the first gust of the sirocco, calling it il vento cattivo, the evil wind. These weren't formal devotions, but they proved the human mind still reflexively attributed intention to the air's movements. The most telling survivals linger in language. The Navajo still use the same word, nilchi, for both wind and the life force. In Japan, kaze means wind but also hints at divine inspiration, as when a sudden idea is said to come, like a wind. Even the modern phrase, winds of change, unconsciously echoes the Babylonian belief that shifting breezes heralded upheaval. What we dismiss as poetic turns out to be ancestral memory in disguise, a whisper of the time when every gust carried meaning. Perhaps the deepest legacy lies in our bodies, not our words. Watch people instinctively close their eyes against a dust-laden gust, or how crowds gasp when a hurricane-force wind rattles skyscrapers. That visceral reaction, part awe, part fear, is the same tremor our ancestors felt standing before stone altars. We may have mapped the jet stream and harnessed wind turbines, but when the trees bend double and the power lines hum, something primal still stirs. The gods have left the wind, but the wind hasn't left us. Even in our hyper-rational age, the wind still whispers to us, not as gods, but as metaphors that shape how we understand our place in the world. Hayao Miyazaki's animated masterpiece The Wind Rises doesn't just use breeze as backdrop. It makes the wind a silent protagonist, carrying dreams, scattering ashes, and bending the arc of history like it once bent desert sands. The film's title echoes an old Japanese proverb, "The wind rises, we must try to live," a phrase that could have been lifted from an ancient mariner's prayer. Meanwhile, Kansas's Dust in the Wind distills 3,000 years of wind mythology into a single haunting line. All we are is dust in the wind. It's no accident these works resonate so deeply. They tap into the same primal connection our ancestors felt when they watched storms rewrite landscapes overnight. Environmental activists today speak of reading the wind when tracking pollution plumes or predicting wildfire paths, unaware they're using the same language as Babylonian wind priests. Climate change documentaries frame shifting wind patterns as messages from the planet, mirroring how Nabatean traders once decoded gusts as divine warnings. Even the phrase "winds of change," tossed around in political speeches and business seminars, carries the ghost of ancient omen reading. What was once literal belief has become symbolic shorthand, but the emotional weight remains unchanged. When a protester ties a ribbon to a fence and watches it flutter, they're participating in a ritual older than Stonehenge, using wind as a visible sign of invisible forces. Literature keeps these old intuitions alive in subtle ways. In the prophet, Khalil Gibran writes of love as the wind's way, capricious, uncontrollable, yet essential. Modern fantasy novels still feature wind spirits, from Avatar, The Last Airbender's airborne benders to the name of the wind's elemental magic. Even children's stories like The Wind in the Willows personify breezes as cheeky, unseen characters. These aren't just creative choices, they're cultural memories. The human brain still processes wind the same way our ancestors did, as something alive. Neurological studies show we anthropomorphize wind sounds instinctively, hearing sighs in gentle breezes and growls in gales. Our fiction simply makes explicit what our neurons already believe. Perhaps the most poignant modern echo lies in music. Indigenous Australian didgeridoo players mimic desert winds in circular breathing techniques passed down for millennia. Icelandic band Sigur Rós uses wind harps in their recordings, creating unearthly tones that could soundtrack a Sumerian ritual. Even pop songs like Bob Dylan's "Blowin' in the Wind" or Fleetwood Mac's "Storms" treat wind as a moral force, a keeper of truths too vast for words. These artists might not kneel before storm gods, but they channel the same awe. The thread connecting all these expressions is the wind's timeless duality: destroyer and nurturer, messenger and mystery. When a climate scientist describes jet streams as the planet's circulatory system, they're not so far removed from the Egyptians who saw Shu's breath in every gust. The vocabulary has changed, but the wonder remains. We've swapped altars for algorithms, yet still find ourselves pausing on windy hilltops, feeling that old, inexplicable pull. The gods have left the sky, but the wind still carries their echo, if we're quiet enough to hear it. Recent excavations are rewriting our understanding of ancient spirituality, revealing how deeply wind worship was embedded in the physical landscape. In Oman's remote Dhofar Mountains, archaeologists uncovered a 3rd century BC temple unlike any other, its walls lined with precisely angled copper pipes that hummed when the seasonal monsoon winds rushed through them. These weren't just decorative features, they formed an intricate Aeolian instrument tuned to specific frequencies. Offerings found at the site included miniature bronze chariots with sail-like attachments, suggesting worshippers symbolically sent prayers, riding the wind to their deity. Even more telling were the stone tablets inscribed with wind directions and corresponding prophecies, effectively creating the world's oldest known meteorological oracle system. Equally compelling evidence comes from Petra's so-called wind tombs, where recent LiDAR scans revealed hidden chambers positioned to amplify specific wind patterns. The Nabateans didn't randomly carve burial sites into cliff faces. They selected locations where swirling eddies created distinct harmonic tones during seasonal wind shifts. Analysis of these niches shows they're concentrated along natural wind tunnels where the sirocco's roar transforms into something resembling human speech. The elite weren't just buried with gold and spices, they were laid to rest where the desert's breath could eternally whisper secrets to their spirits. Perhaps the most startling discovery emerged from Turkey's Mount Nemrut, where a 1st century BCE sanctuary dedicated to the Commagene kingdom's wind gods contained something unexpected: a primitive wind recording device. A rotating stone cylinder marked with ancient glyphs was positioned to align with changing wind directions, while accompanying inscriptions described priests interpreting these shifts as divine messages. Modern engineers reconstructed the mechanism and found it could predict seasonal wind changes with 80% accuracy, proving these priests were equal parts mystics and early scientists. The smoking gun for wind worship's prevalence came from a less glamorous fine trash. Midden heaps at Mediterranean coastal sites contained thousands of broken clay wind charms shaped like spirals or whirlwinds, all dating between 1200 to 800 BCE. These weren't elite artifacts but common household items, suggesting wind reverence permeated all social classes. Chemical analysis revealed many were intentionally shattered during storms, likely as protective rituals. At Carthage harbor, divers located dozens of lead curse tablets invoking the wind god Baal Hammon to wreck rival ships, proof that wind deities weren't just abstract concepts but active participants in daily struggles. What makes these discoveries revolutionary is how they collapse the false divide between spiritual and practical in ancient life. The same windpipes that carried divine messages also ventilated temples. Those Petra tombs positioned for acoustic resonance, their placement reduced sand accumulation, preserving the dead. Every ritual innovation doubled as survival technology in harsh desert environments. When modern scientists use wind tunnels to test ancient structure designs, they often find the old ways work startlingly well. The whispering galleries of Choco Canyon, for instance, naturally amplify cooling breezes while dampening destructive gusts. Perhaps most poignant are the personal traces left behind. In Egypt's Dakhla oasis, a pottery shard bears a child's crude drawing of a wind spirit alongside the words, "Make father's boat go fast." At a Roman outpost in Libya, a soldier's diary describes bribing local priests to sing the wind around enemy camps. These intimate glimpses remind us that wind worship wasn't some abstract state religion. It was the breath of daily existence, shaping everything from childhood hopes to military strategy. The stones may have forgotten the prayers, but the wind remembers. When civilizations imagined the end of all things, they didn't picture silence. They heard the screaming of the wind. The Book of Revelation's fourth horseman rides a pale horse, but it's the wind at his back that carries the plague, a detail often overlooked. Ancient readers would have understood immediately. Wind wasn't just transportation for disease. It was the very breath of divine judgment, invisible and inescapable. This motif appears even earlier in Jeremiah, where Yahweh promises to winnow Babylon with a whirlwind, using the same imagery of wind as both purifier and executioner. The Hebrew word used here, ruach, blurs the line between wind, breath, and spirit, suggesting the apocalypse isn't just brought by wind, but is wind, a force that unravels creation as easily as it once formed it. Norse mythology takes this further with Hrísvelg, the corpse-eating giant who perches at the edge of the universe in eagle form. His name literally means corpse swallower, and when he beats his wings, the resulting winds don't just signal Ragnarök, they actively peel the world apart. Poetic Edda verses describe these gales scouring the earth so violently that mountains crumble, like dry leaves in a gale, a metaphor that would resonate with anyone who's seen a desert simum strip flesh from bone. What's chilling is how these myths mirror real geological events: volcanic winters that darkened skies for years, or the Dust Bowl storms that seemed biblical in their wrath. The ancients may have lacked our science, but they recognized wind's capacity for absolute erasure. Aztec cosmology offers a grimmer variation. Their fifth son prophecy foretold the world's end through wind-borne knives, a poetic yet terrifying image of hurricanes carrying obsidian shards. Codices depict these winds as the breath of Tezcatlipoca's smoking mirror, each gust peeling away layers of reality until only the gods remain. Modern archaeology lends eerie credence to this. Tephra deposits near Tenochtitlan suggest catastrophic windstorms did indeed precede the empire's collapse, carrying volcanic glass across hundreds of miles. When survivors described the sky itself cutting us, they weren't just spinning metaphors, they were recording trauma in the only language they had. These apocalyptic winds share an unsettling consistency across cultures. Hindu scriptures describe prana, the life-giving wind, reversing course during the Kali Yuga to become Vayu's annihilating breath. Zoroastrian texts warn of a final purifying storm so intense it melts metals, while Maori legends speak of Tohirametea's hurricane wrath dismantling creation. Even the Hopi prophecy of Koyaanisqatsi climaxes with a great purification by wind, stripping away corruption. The parallel isn't coincidental. Wind's ability to both nourish and obliterate made it the perfect metaphor for cosmic renewal. After all, what force but wind could simultaneously scatter seeds and level cities, whisper and roar, build dunes and wear down mountains? What's most revealing is how these stories persist in secular doomsday scenarios today. Post-nuclear fiction invariably describes radioactive winds scouring the Earth, while climate change warnings evoke unstoppable feedback loops with the same inevitability as Hrisvelg's wings. When filmmakers want to signal impending doom, they don't show earthquakes or fire first. They show trembling leaves, swirling dust, the eerie calm before the storm. These aren't just dramatic tropes, they're cultural memories hardwired into us through millennia of watching the wind rewrite landscapes. The next time you feel a sudden gust on a still day, consider this: your pulse quickens not because of the air itself, but because some ancient part of you still hears in that breeze the whisper of endings. There's something primal about the way we react to wind, how a sudden gust can make us turn our heads, or how the moan of a storm sends shivers down our spines. Psychologists call this hyperactive agency detection, a hardwired survival mechanism that primes us to perceive intention behind ambiguous stimuli. When our ancestors heard leaves rustling without visible cause, their brains didn't chalk it up to random air currents. They instinctively assumed a presence, a spirit, a god, something alive and watching. This reflex isn't irrational, it's evolutionary. Mistaking the wind for a predator might mean unnecessary fear, but failing to detect an actual threat could be fatal. Over millennia, this bias shaped how entire cultures interpreted the natural world, transforming breezes into messengers and tempests into divine wrath. The phenomenon taps into what's known as the uncanny valley of sound, the eerie discomfort we feel when noises almost but don't quite mimic human speech. Wind whistling through canyon walls or howling around eaves often falls into this category, producing patterns that tease the edges of language. Neuroscientists have found that when the brain encounters these almost voices, the auditory cortex lights up as if processing actual words, while the amygdala triggers low-level alarm. It's no wonder ancient priests claimed to decipher prophecies in desert zephyrs, or that sailors swore they heard drowned men calling in gales. Our minds are built to find meaning in chaos, especially when it whispers like a conscious thing. But wind's power goes deeper than mistaken agency. Its invisibility makes it uniquely mysterious, a force we feel but never see. Unlike rain or sunlight, wind exists only through its effects, bending grass, scattering dust, chilling skin. This intangibility mirrors how many cultures conceptualize the divine, present yet unseen, manifest only through action. the Hebrew ruach, the Greek pneuma, the Sanskrit prana, all terms for both wind and spirit, reflecting an intuitive link between breath and life force. When the Egyptians depicted Shu, god of air, as a man holding up the sky, they weren't just personifying nature, they were articulating a profound truth about human perception. We're compelled to give form to formless things, to animate the invisible. Modern experiments reveal how persistent this tendency is. In one study, participants exposed to infrasound, low-frequency waves produced by wind reported sensations of being watched or fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures, even in sterile lab settings. Another project had volunteers listen to wind recordings from sacred sites. Over 70% described the sounds as intentional, attributing them to everything from ghosts to nature spirits. These responses weren't rooted in superstition, but in the brain's predictive coding, our constant effort to match sensory input with familiar patterns. When the input is ambiguous, we default to the oldest patterns we know: agency, presence, mind. What's remarkable is how these ancient intuitions align with contemporary psychology. The pattern-seeking that led Babylonians to read omens in wind shifts is the same cognitive tool that helps scientists identify climate trends today. The awe a Navajo elder feels watching a dust devil dance isn't so different from the wonder a physicist experiences unraveling turbulence equations. Both are attempts to make sense of the ineffable, one through story, the other through data. This continuity suggests that wind reverence wasn't primitive ignorance but an early form of curiosity, a way of engaging with the world's mysteries long before microscopes or satellites. The next time you pause to listen to the wind, know that the chill on your neck isn't just air moving. It's the echo of countless generations who stood under the same sky, straining to hear meaning in the murmur of the unseen. Our tools have changed, but our instinct remains, to lean into the unknown and imagine it leaning back. Across countless cultures and eras, the wind has been more than just a force of nature. It's been the unseen ferryman of the soul. The ancient Egyptians mapped this belief into their very geography. They called the north wind the Horus breeze, believing it carried the dead toward the field of reeds, their paradisiacal afterlife. Tomb paintings depict bar spirits, the part of the soul resembling a human-headed bird riding these currents, their wings outstretched to catch the celestial draft. But this wasn't poetic whimsy, it was rooted in observation. The Nile's northward flow meant boats sailed south with the current but relied on northerly winds to return. For a civilization that saw death as a journey, it was natural to envision the wind as the engine of transcendence, guiding souls just as it guided ships home. Half a world away, the Navajo Dene hold a strikingly similar reverence for the wind's role in the afterlife. Their traditions speak of Chindi, the residual spiritual energy left behind after death, which rides dust devils, those spinning vortexes of desert wind. Elders warn against standing in a dust devil's path, not just for the physical discomfort, but because it might carry traces of the departed. This belief reflects a profound ecological intimacy. In the arid southwest, dust devils are both constant and ephemeral, appearing without warning to dance across mesas before dissolving into nothingness. What better metaphor for the soul's journey than a visible yet untouchable force that rises from the earth only to vanish skyward? The parallels don't end there. In Japanese Shinto, it's said that kami spirits travel on the kamikaze, the divine wind that once saved the islands from Mongol invasion. Celtic lore describes the Shi-Gaoth, fairy winds that carry souls to Na and Og, the land of eternal youth. Even the Amazonian Yanomami believe the breath of the dead becomes part of the forest's whispering winds. These shared motifs point to something deeper than cultural diffusion. They reveal a universal human instinct to associate breath with spirit. The Hebrew ruach, the Greek pneuma, the Sanskrit prana, all words that mean both wind and life force. When a loved one exhales their last breath, cultures worldwide have imagined that final sigh joining the eternal winds, becoming one with the invisible currents that animate the world. Archaeology offers tangible proof of these beliefs. In Peru's Nazca Desert, researchers found mummies buried with wind cords, threads tied to their wrappings, symbolizing tethers to catch the afterlife's breezes. Viking ship graves were often oriented so the sails, those stone carvings, faced prevailing winds, ready to carry the deceased to Valhalla. Most haunting are the wind windows in Mycenaean tombs, narrow shafts aligned with seasonal gusts, designed to let souls come and go on the air's currents. These weren't abstract symbols but functional architecture, built by people who truly believed the wind was a two-way road between worlds. Modern science lends an eerie resonance to these ancient intuitions. Atmospheric studies show that every breath we take contains molecules once exhaled by Caesar, Cleopatra, or countless others, literal stardust of the departed cycling endlessly through the global wind system. When a Navajo elder says, "The wind remembers," it's not just metaphor. The air around us quite literally carries traces of every life that's ever breathed. Perhaps that's why, even today, we feel an uncanny kinship with the wind, why we still scatter ashes to the breeze or pause when an unexpected gust ruffles our hair. Somewhere in our bones, we recognize what the ancients knew. The wind isn't just moving air, it's the archive of the invisible, the library of lost voices, the eternal current that carries us all in time beyond the horizon. The wind's duality, both life-giver and destroyer, found striking expression in how ancient cultures gendered their deities. Male wind gods like Mesopotamia's Enlil or Egypt's Shu were often depicted as sovereign rulers, their authority as unshakable as the seasonal winds they commanded. Enlil's very name meant Lord Wind, and Sumerian hymns describe him holding the tablets of destiny, his breath dictating the fates of cities and kings. These figures embodied control, their winds predictable as celestial bureaucracy, north winds for planting, south winds for harvest, each direction a cog in the divine machinery of order. Their power wasn't just atmospheric, it was political, reflecting patriarchal structures where men held dominion over calendars, trade routes, and war, all realms dictated by wind patterns. Yet alongside these stern male deities fluttered a host of female wind spirits, chaotic and untamed. The Greek harpies, whose name literally meant snatchers, were storm-winged women who personified sudden squalls, stealing food from the starving or carrying souls to the underworld on their tempestuous wings. Celtic myth spoke of the Cailleach, a blue-faced crone who stirred winter gales with her staff, while Slavic folklore warned of the Vela, ethereal maidens whose dancing whipped whirlwinds across the steppes. Unlike their male counterparts, these spirits weren't worshipped in temples but feared at crossroads, their influence localized and mercurial. A farmer might pray to Enlil for consistent breezes, but he'd hang charms in his fields to ward off the Vela's capricious gusts. This gendered split reveals ancient anxieties about nature's dual nature. Male wind gods represented the ideal predictable forces harnessed for agriculture and navigation, much like the idealized male role as providers and protectors. Female wind spirits, conversely, embodied the real, the uncontrollable storms that sank ships, the freak gusts that flattened villages. Their femininity wasn't incidental. It mirrored societal views of women as emotionally volatile, their power beautiful but dangerous. The harpies' avian forms even played into this. echoing the ancient trope of women's speech as shrill or bird-like wind, as a voice that couldn't be reasoned with, only appeased or avoided. But exceptions prove the rule. Japan's Fujin, though male, is portrayed as a wild-eyed demon, his bag of winds bursting chaotically, a rare male deity embodying wind's destructive side. Conversely, Egypt's goddess Kebui took the form of 4 ram-headed women governing the cardinal winds, a rare female figure granted orderly dominion. These outliers often arose where power structures differed. Fujin's chaos reflects Shinto's embrace of nature's unpredictability, while Kebui's role may stem from Egypt's relative gender equality in certain priestly roles. The most telling evidence lies in rituals. Male wind gods received structured sacrifices: bulls for Enlil at Nippur's ziggurat, wine libations for Aeolus on his floating island. Female wind spirits demanded improvisation ribbons tied to trees for the Vela, honey left on stones for the Harpies. The former reinforced societal hierarchies, the latter acknowledged life's uncertainties. Even the tools differed. Bronze trumpets summoned male wind deities, while flutes or whistles, instruments linked to breathe and caprice, called female spirits. Today, these archetypes linger in surprising ways. Modern hurricane naming conventions alternate male and female names, yet studies show people perceive female-named storms as less threatening, a bias echoing ancient assumptions about gendered power. When we speak of Mother Nature's wrath or Father Sky's decree, we're unknowingly breathing life into winds that have carried these projections for millennia. The next time a storm rattles your windows, listen closely. Beneath the howl, you might just hear the echoes of a 1,000-year-old conversation about who gets to control the uncontrollable and who must bear the blame when it breaks free. The wind's ancient whispers are finding new listeners in the 21st century, as modern pagan movements breathe fresh life into rituals once thought lost to time. Across social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram, hashtags like #windmagic and #stormcalling reveal a surprising trend: urban witches crafting wind charms from repurposed materials, or groups gathering on coastal cliffs to sing to the rising gales. These aren't historical reenactments, but living traditions adapting old wisdom to new contexts. A Brooklyn-based Druid collective, for instance, blends Celtic wind invocations with climate activism, interpreting hurricane warnings as Gaia's urgent messages. Meanwhile, Scandinavian heathens have reintroduced the Vindblot, a wind-honoring ceremony where participants tie ribbons inscribed with environmental pledges to birch trees, letting the breeze carry their intentions. This revival isn't just about nostalgia, it's a response to contemporary anxieties. Climate change has made the wind's power impossible to ignore, from wildfires spread by Santa Ana winds to superstorms battering coastlines. Neo-pagans argue their rituals offer a framework for processing these upheavals spiritually, not just scientifically. When we call the 4 winds in ritual, we're acknowledging our dependency on forces beyond human control, explains Elspeth Greenwood, a British Druid priestess. Her group's wind dialogues involve meditating on weather patterns before collaboratively composing poems inspired by the day's breezes, a practice equal parts art therapy and meteorology. Yet these practices walk a delicate line between revival and appropriation. When non-native practitioners sell plain-style wind catchers online, Lakota elders like Chief Arvol Looking Horse publicly challenge the commodification of sacred traditions. Conversely, some Norse reconstructionists face backlash for co-opting Viking wind runes while ignoring their historical ties to colonial violence. The debate hinges on a critical question: when does inspiration become theft? Some groups navigate this by creating entirely new symbology like the urban wind wheel, a modern glyph blending recycling logos with traditional spiral motifs used by eco-pagans to bless city parks. Academic researchers are taking note. Anthropologist Dr. Leila Fernandez's study of European wind ritual revivals found participants often combine rigorous historical research with personal innovation. One German group consulted medieval texts to reconstruct a wind divination method using suspended feathers, then adapted it with smartphone anemometers to track correlations between wind speed and ritual outcomes. It's not about replicating the past perfectly, notes Fernandez, but about creating meaningful relationships with natural forces in a digital age. The movement's most poignant aspect might be its democratization of sacred space. Unlike ancient wind temples requiring elite priesthoods, modern rituals often unfold in backyards or public beaches. A viral video from Australia shows children constructing wind altars from seashells and driftwood after bushfires, a spontaneous fusion of play and reverence. This accessibility echoes paganism's core ethos that divinity isn't locked in distant heavens, but pulsing through the air around us, felt every time a gust chases leaves down a sidewalk or rattles a subway grate. Yet challenges persist. Instagram aesthetics sometimes overshadow substance, with hash wind which posts prioritizing photogenic smoke bundles over deeper engagement. And the line between spiritual practice and performative trendiness blurs when corporations co-opt symbols like a recent luxury perfume ad misusing Navajo wind imagery. Still, for many practitioners, these rituals anchor them in a chaotic world. As one Oregon-based coven's mantra goes, listen when the wind speaks. It carried your ancestors' voices, it will carry yours too. Whether praying with ribbons or protesting pipelines, today's wind worshippers share an ancient conviction. That air isn't empty space, but a living, speaking presence demanding our attention. Wind has always been the poet's perfect metaphor, restless, invisible, and brimming with contradictions. Homer didn't just describe Iris, the messenger goddess, as swift, he called her wind-footed, capturing how divine words move through the world like a sudden gust, unexpected, undeniable, gone before you can grasp them. Centuries later, Shelley would personify the west wind as both destroyer and preserver, its autumn breath scattering dead leaves like thoughts from a restless mind. What makes these depictions so enduring isn't just their beauty, but their precision. Writers across cultures have seized upon wind's unique duality, how it can caress or crush, whisper or howl, to mirror human emotions too vast for simple language. Arabic poets elevated this tradition to an art form. In classical Casidas, the wind Macron letter 1E2-5 isn't merely background, it's an active character shaping destiny. The 6th century poet Imru al-Qais opens his most famous work by addressing a night wind that carries memories of lost lovers, blending meteorological and emotional turbulence. Later Sufi mystics like Rumi transformed wind into a symbol of divine breath, unseen yet animating all things. A single couplet might compare a lover's sigh to the chamal wind, both capable of stirring dormant seeds in the desert and the soul. This wasn't mere embellishment, it reflected a worldview where nature and human experience were inextricably entwined. The Romantic poets, though separated from these Arabic traditions by centuries and continents, arrived at startlingly similar imagery. Wordsworth's winds that will be howling at all hours in Tintern Abbey echo the Bedouin trope of wind as a restless mourner. Byron's tempest-loving raven, riding the storm mirrors pre-Islamic odes where djinn race hurricanes across the empty quarter. Even Emily Dickinson, writing in her quiet Amherst room, captured wind's paradoxes, calling it a narrow fellow in the grass one moment, a tyrannous unseen force the next. What unites these voices is their recognition of wind as the ultimate shapeshifter, capable of embodying fleeting thoughts or cosmic upheavals with equal grace. Modern literature continues this legacy, though with fresh nuances. In The God of Small Things, Arundhati Roy uses the moth-smelling wind of Kerala to foreshadow tragedy, its very sweetness a warning. Japanese haiku masters distill wind's essence into 17 syllables bashos. Autumn wind slash through the pine grove slash the sound of the sea, collapses distance between forest and ocean through sheer auditory alchemy. Even fantasy epics like The Name of the Wind weave ancient wind symbolism into new myths, proving its narrative power remains undimmed by time. What makes wind such an irresistible literary device? Perhaps its very invisibility demands we cloak it in meaning, its intangibility a blank canvas for our deepest fears and longings. When a poet describes a zephyr carrying the scent of lost summers, or a novelist paints a gale as the collective cry of the oppressed, they're doing what the ancients did, listening to the air's secrets and translating them into stories that outlast stone. The wind may not read the verses we dedicate to it, but it continues to turn the pages, scattering our words like leaves across generations. The desert winds that once whispered prophecies to pharaohs and carried prayers to forgotten gods still brush against our skin today, not as divine messengers, but as living threads woven through time. Every gust that rustles your curtains or tugs at your hair carries echoes of civilizations who heard voices in these very currents. The Sumerian farmer scanning the horizon for Enlil's breath, the Nabatean priest deciphering omens in Petra's singing cliffs, the Zoroastrian tending sacred flames fanned by Vayu's invisible hand, they've all left their imprint on the wind we feel now. Science may have unraveled the how of atmospheric pressure and jet streams, but it hasn't dulled the primal awe we feel when a storm's first gust chills the back of our necks. That shiver down your spine, it's ancestral memory. What's extraordinary is how these ancient intuitions foreshadowed modern discoveries. When Egyptian priests claimed the north wind carried blessings, they couldn't have known it transported mineral-rich Saharan dust to fertilize the Amazon. When Navajo elders spoke of spirit-filled dust devils, they were describing the same vortices that NASA now studies as models for atmospheric dynamics. The wind's true magic lies in this duality. It's been measured and mapped, yet still defies full comprehension. Meteorologists can predict a hurricane's path with satellite precision, but no algorithm can capture the haunting wail of wind through canyon walls that made the ancients certain something listened back. This lingering mystery explains why wind symbolism thrives in our digital age. Video games like Journey use wind as a guiding character, its gusts literally pushing players toward revelation. Climate activists adopt the language of wind worship, calling storms the Earth's fever, and breezes its labored breath. Even astronauts report an uncanny sensation when viewing hurricanes from space, a disconnect between intellectual understanding and visceral awe that mirrors the gap between ancient myth and modern science. The wind remains our last tangible connection to the numinous in an increasingly explained world. So the next time a sudden breeze lifts fallen leaves into a dancing spiral, or a summer storm rattles your windows with elemental fury, pause for a moment. Close your eyes and listen, not with your ears but with the part of your mind that still remembers how to hear the sacred in the sigh of the unseen. The languages have changed, the gods have faded, but the conversation continues. The wind still speaks. The only question is whether we've forgotten how to reply. Drop your most memorable wind encounter in the comments. Was it a desert zephyr that seemed to whisper your name, or a gale that felt like the universe itself was exhaling? And if you've ever felt that eerie sense of the invisible brushing against your skin, hit that subscribe button. Together, we'll keep unraveling the myths that still breathe